Have you ever been judged not for who you are, but for what you don't have? That's the question I kept replaying in my head that night as the clinking of wine glasses mixed with soft jazz and polite laughter. We were celebrating the 30th wedding anniversary of the Rivas family, my wife's parents. The room sparkled with tailored suits, imported champagne, and the kind of quiet arrogance that only old money carries with ease. And then came his voice, loud enough for the entire table to hear, subtle enough to sound like a joke. He's a charming guy, sure, but let's be honest, Matías married Isabella for comfort, not commitment. He doesn't even have a real job. No one laughed, but no one disagreed either. I didn't look up, I didn't flinch. I simply sipped my wine and let it sink in. Eduardo Rivas, the man who built a real estate empire with iron discipline and zero imagination, had just reduced me once again to a charity case at his table. What he didn't know, what no one at that polished oak table knew, was that the software company he always mocked was being acquired in 4 days. $18 million. Not that I was going to tell him that. Not yet. Sometimes dignity grows in silence. And revenge. It doesn't need to raise its voice. If you've ever been underestimated, keep watching, because this story is for you. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been in a moment like that, where silence felt louder than words. And if you connect with stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me to the end. What happened next changed everything. I wasn't born into money. My father repaired diesel engines on the edge of town, and my mother managed a tiny corner grocery where I spent most of my afternoons restocking shelves and watching people trade stories for cigarettes and stale bread. But even back then, I understood something most people in that world never voiced out loud. Survival isn't the same as living, and if I wanted more than just making ends meet, I'd have to build it myself. My name is Matías Herrera. I'm 32 years old, and what I lack in pedigree, I've always made up for in clarity. I first met Isabella Rivas during a tech talk at the university. I was giving a low-budget presentation on data efficiency in urban housing, barely enough people in the room to fill the front row. She was there as part of a social project for her master's program. While others yawned, she took notes. Afterwards, she approached me, not with praise, but with a question. Why hasn't anyone built this for real estate yet? It wasn't flirtation. It was curiosity. And that's what struck me. She was brilliant, grounded, and yes, unmistakably out of my league. Her father, Eduardo Rivas, owned over 60 commercial properties across Latin America. Her mother came from old Catalonian landowners. Her world ran on influence, capital, and caution. Mine on Wi-Fi freelance coding gigs and late-night ramen. Still, somehow we fit. In the beginning, her family tolerated me thinking I'd fade away like a phase. But I didn't. Isabella and I moved in together after just 6 months. We cooked side by side in a kitchen barely wide enough for 2 people to turn. And when I proposed a year later at a small beach where neither of us checked our phones, she said yes without hesitation. That's when the Rivas family's tone shifted. Eduardo pulled me aside at the engagement dinner. I hope you understand what marrying into this family means, he said, like I was joining a corporate board, not his daughter's life. Security matters more than passion. I told him I agreed. But what I didn't say was that I planned to redefine what security actually meant. From that moment forward, Eduardo watched me, not with interest but with skepticism. The kind of cold curiosity one might reserve for a rescue dog, grateful you're here, but never fully trusting you won't bite. He never saw what I was building. Not in those early months, not in the long nights when Isabella was asleep, and I sat glowing in the light of my laptop, sketching what would later become Terramind, the software that ironically would change everything in his world. But at the time, I was just the handsome young man who got lucky enough to marry his daughter. And in Eduardo's eyes, that meant I hadn't earned anything. After the wedding, I made a decision that surprised everyone, especially Eduardo. I turned down his offer to get my feet wet in the Rivas family's real estate group. He said I could shadow one of their regional directors. Learn the ropes, he called it. What he meant was know your place. Instead, I stayed in the small apartment Isabella and I shared in the southern part of the city. No doorman, no marble floors, no private elevators. Just a second-hand desk wedged beside the kitchen table and a 10-year-old laptop with a cracked screen. That's where TerraMind was born. The idea was simple: build a platform that gave small real estate agencies the power of big data. While Rivas and Asociados and global players had access to predictive analytics heat maps, lead conversion tools, and custom CRMs, the mom-and-pop realtors had Excel. TerraMind would bridge that gap. My plan was to create a clean, affordable software that helped agencies forecast prices, understand local behavior, and manage properties smarter with just a few clicks. It didn't need to be flashy. It needed to work. For the first year, I coded in silence. I cold-emailed property managers. I pitched at small business expos no one cared about. I burned through what little savings I had from my freelance work. Every time I tried to explain it to Eduardo, he'd wave me off. Sounds clever, but people don't want more software. They want buildings, land, tangible value. He didn't get it. He never asked about my user base or the code behind my prototype. Instead, he dropped hints job postings from his friends' companies' openings in sales or business development. I knew what he was doing. He wasn't offering help. He was offering an exit. Isabella believed in me. But even she had her moments. There were nights she came home exhausted from board meetings, dropping her handbag onto the floor while I was still debugging version 0.9. "I just want to know how long you can keep doing this," she'd whisper, not unkindly, but with worry in her eyes. "As long as it takes," I'd answer, but I could feel the weight in the room. Not judgment, just fear. She had grown up with security, with guarantees. I was offering neither. By the end of the second year, things looked grim. My first pilot agency won. I had spent 4 months courting cut ties due to budget issues. Another went back to using spreadsheets, saying TerraMind was too modern for their agents. I nearly gave up. And then Eduardo made his boldest move. At a Christmas brunch, as I was helping slice fruit in the kitchen, he stepped in beside me and said quietly, "I know someone at Nova Data. They're hiring junior analysts. You'd be good at that kind of structured work. Good pay, predictable hours." He meant well, but he didn't understand. I didn't want to plug into something. I wanted to build something. I remember standing there, knife in hand, thinking, this man has built apartment towers from blueprints, but he can't see the architecture I'm creating through the code. And maybe that's what stung most. He didn't doubt the market. He doubted me. He doubted that a man like me, without family backing, without a polished degree, without money, could ever build something worthy of respect. That doubt would become my fuel, because while Eduardo kept counting buildings, I started counting users. Quietly, carefully, until the numbers became too big to ignore. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in April, just past 9 a.m., when I received an email from a boutique real estate agency in Bogotá called Valterra Urbana. The subject line was simple: interested in testing TerraMind. At first I thought it was spam, but as I read on, my hands began to tremble. They had heard about TerraMind through a closed Facebook group for small Latin real estate firms. One of the early agencies I had demoed to, but who hadn't signed, had apparently mentioned us in passing. Valterra had grown frustrated with traditional CRM systems and wanted something cleaner, more predictive, more intuitive. I onboarded them that same week. I customized the dashboard, worked out bugs in real time, and even added a Spanish language toggle on the fly. I slept maybe 5 hours across 4 days, but by Friday they were hooked. They didn't just like the software, they raved about it. And then the ripple began. By June, Valterra had recommended TerraMind to 4 other boutique firms. 2 of them converted within weeks. By August, we had a full waiting list. 12 paying clients, agencies in Santiago, Medellin, and Querétaro, all eager for onboarding. I wasn't sleeping more, but for the first time I wasn't panicking. The code was holding, the model was working, and my inbox had stopped being a graveyard. That's when NovaCap Ventures reached out. Their email was far more formal. We're monitoring developments in Latin PropTech. Terramind has attracted our attention. Would you be open to a conversation? At first, I thought it was just a talent poach attempt trying to bring me in as a consultant. But it wasn't. They had been watching, tracking growth, reading reviews, and they didn't want me. They wanted Terramind. The first Zoom meeting with their strategy director left me stunned. They talked about acquisition market penetration and scalability. They had already done a private audit of our feature suite based on demo links. It wasn't just a courtesy call. It was a pitch from them to me. We spent 6 weeks in deep conversations. I looped in a lawyer, then a startup acquisition advisor. We kept things quiet. No press, no leaks. Isabella didn't even know. I told her I was in talks with a few industry folks, but nothing concrete. Why? Because for the first time in my life, I had the leverage, and I wasn't about to let anyone, especially Eduardo, steer that moment off course. The deal we landed was more than I ever imagined. $18 million in cash, a 2-year CTO role with full autonomy inside NovaCap's PropTech wing, 5% equity in their restructured division. When I signed the papers on a rainy Thursday morning in a downtown notary's office, I felt still, not euphoric, not triumphant, just still. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't pride. It was clarity. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. Because the thing I had built in silence while Eduardo judged me, while people asked if I had found a real job, yet had become undeniable. But I still didn't tell anyone. I went home, kissed Isabella on the forehead, and cooked dinner like any other night. Because I wanted the world to stay the same for just a few more days. I wanted Eduardo to sleep in his glass mansion utterly convinced that I was still the man eating from his hand. He had no idea. But the silence was about to get loud. The press release was scheduled for Monday 8:30 a.m. sharp. NovaCap's legal team wanted it to go live simultaneously on their official site, LinkedIn, and 2 of the largest Latin American business publications. I had seen the headline a dozen times in draft format, but when I opened the live version that morning, it still hit like a wave. I hadn't braced for NovaCap Ventures acquires Terramind $18 million deal to revolutionize real estate analytics in Latin America. For a moment, I just sat there in our apartment staring at the screen. No champagne, no grand speech, just the soft hum of our refrigerator and the notification pings beginning to erupt from my phone. By 9:00 a.m., the article was trending in the Latin tech community. By 9:15, LinkedIn messages were piling in. Former colleagues, developers I barely knew, professors, even a guy I once helped debug a Python script 3 years ago. Everyone wanted to congratulate, reconnect, or pitch. Isabella called from work less than an hour later. She was breathless. Why am I finding this out from my boss? She just walked into my office with the article printed out. I stayed silent for a beat. I wanted it to be real official before I made it emotional. There was silence on her end, too. "Then you knew I'd tell my dad," she said. "I counted on it," I replied. I didn't say it with anger. I said it like someone who had waited a long time for a moment that needed to arrive without warning. I wanted Eduardo to read about it, like everyone else. No phone call to prepare him. No soft landing. Just the undeniable truth on paper, as cold and public as every dismissal he had ever sent my way. By noon, Eduardo still hadn't called, but I knew he had seen it. Isabella's sister had sent her a screenshot of their family group chat where her mother posted the headline and added, "Incredible news. So proud of you both." Still nothing from Eduardo. No text, no email, no forced congratulations. And yet something in me didn't feel vengeful. I didn't want him to grovel. I just wanted him to sit with it, to sit with the weight of what he hadn't seen, of what he'd refused to see. That night we had dinner like usual. Pasta, some wine, the city outside our window oblivious to the tiny private earthquake we were living through. I checked my phone once before bed. No messages from him. And it was perfect, because the silence I had endured for years had finally become his. And I wasn't going to be the one to break it. Not this time. 3 days passed. Then 4. By the 5th day, the press had moved on to other stories, but my inbox hadn't slowed. Terramind had been featured in a tech startup podcast, and NovaCap's CEO had name-dropped our product in a public Q&A. People I hadn't heard from in years were resurfacing, but not Eduardo. He hadn't called, hadn't emailed, not even a cold congratulations. I knew why. He wasn't just embarrassed. He was struggling to recalculate the story he had so carefully crafted for years, the one where I was a charming underachiever who got lucky with his daughter. On Saturday afternoon, just after lunch, there was a knock at our apartment door. I opened it to find him standing there in a perfectly pressed blazer, holding nothing but the weight of everything he hadn't said. He looked older. Not physically, but in posture, in the way a man does when certainty slips from beneath him. "Can we talk?" he asked, eyes not quite meeting mine. I stepped aside without a word. Isabella, hearing the door, came into the living room and froze when she saw her father. He nodded politely. "I'd like to speak with both of you." We sat. He chose the farthest chair from me and exhaled like he'd been holding it in all week. "I owe you an apology," he began. I didn't respond. I wanted to see if this was a performance or something real. "I've been trying to find the right words since Monday," he continued, "and I realize now that I've spent years underestimating you, not just your work, but your judgment, your discipline, your vision." I kept still. No nods. No rescues. Let him carry his own weight. I said some things, over the years, things I believed at the time he said, that you weren't serious, that Isabella deserved better, that your so-called project wasn't real. He looked at her now. "I said it to you too behind closed doors, and I'm ashamed of that." For a moment I saw something crack behind his eyes, not weakness, but regret. I thought I was protecting my daughter from instability, from risk. But really I was projecting my own fear. I don't understand technology or startups. I understand property, paper, rent checks, not code. And instead of admitting that, I mocked it. Still, I said nothing. So he leaned in. When I saw the article, my first instinct wasn't pride. It was panic. I had been so publicly wrong. Not just wrong, but blind. Now I looked at him. "You weren't just wrong about Terramind," I said. "You were wrong about me." He blinked. "You weren't skeptical. You were dismissive. You made your doubt personal. Every time you mentioned job openings, every time you called what I did a phase, you weren't offering help. You were issuing judgment." He nodded slowly. "I know. I confused professional caution with personal superiority. That was arrogance, and I see it now." Isabella hadn't spoken yet, but I could feel her hand brush mine lightly. She was listening like someone who had waited too long for this moment. I took a breath. "I don't need your approval," I said. I never did. But what I needed, and what I think you still owe Isabella, is respect. Respect for her ability to choose a partner. Respect for her clarity. He turned toward her eyes, softer now. "You were right," he said simply. Silence fell over the room. But this time it didn't weigh down. It cleared something. Then he added, "I want to understand now. Terramind, the platform, how it works, what it does. Not as a father-in-law, as someone genuinely curious." It was the first time he had asked a question without judgment, so I told him. For the next 40 minutes, I walked him through Terramind's interface, its prediction engine, its onboarding model, and the way we had scaled without traditional VC funding. He listened. He asked smart questions. And for the first time since I'd married into his family, he spoke to me not as an outsider, but as a peer. When he finally stood to leave, he extended his hand. "I don't expect forgiveness in one afternoon," he said, "but I hope this can be a beginning." I shook his hand. Not because everything was fixed, but because he had finally shown up, not as a father protecting his castle, but as a man willing to rebuild his view of the world. And in that moment, something shifted. Not loud, not grand, just real. For the first time, I wasn't in his house. He was in mine. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift. Eduardo didn't suddenly become warm. He wasn't the kind of man to send heart emojis or offer unsolicited praise. But the next time we saw him at a quiet Sunday lunch hosted by Isabella's mother, he greeted me differently. No rehearsed small talk, no condescending check-ins about how things were going. Instead, he said, "I read your interview in Foro Inmobiliario. That part about integrating behavioral patterns into your pricing engine, that's sharp." I didn't smile, but I acknowledged it with a quiet, "Thanks. It's working better than we expected." And that was enough. Bit by bit, his language changed. So did his tone. He no longer introduced me to his friends as the software guy. He started saying, "This is my son-in-law, Matías." He built a platform that's changing how small agencies operate. It wasn't showmanship. It was finally recognition. Even at family gatherings, the dynamic had shifted. For years, I'd been the guy in the corner explaining to confused uncles what a startup meant. Now, those same uncles were pulling me aside to ask if I could recommend a solution for managing their tenants. Some even asked if I was hiring. And then came the real twist. Eduardo invited me to his office, not the marble and leather one in the main tower, but his private space in the back of their property management headquarters. It was filled with paper files, dusty spreadsheets, and outdated booking systems. He stood there, arms crossed, almost sheepish. "We've been operating like it's still 2008, he admitted. "We're behind, too many moving parts, too much manual oversight, and frankly, I don't understand half of what my operations team reports anymore." I looked at him carefully. "What are you asking me?" He took a deep breath. "Help me modernize it. Digitize the structure, not just for efficiency, but for longevity. I want the business to outlive me." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. This was the same man who once suggested I apply for a junior sales job in a firm he barely respected. Now he was asking me to help rebuild the very empire he once used to measure my worth against. I didn't give him an answer right away. I told him I'd think about it. But when I left his office that afternoon, the weight of the moment followed me. Not because I finally won, but because something far more important had happened. Eduardo no longer saw me as the kid who married into his fortune. He saw me as a man who had built his own. And maybe more importantly, he had stopped trying to make me like him and started asking what he could learn from me. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, finally. After years of quiet battles, we stood eye to eye. And that more than any headline or title was the victory I didn't even know I needed. 2 years later, we bought a house in the hills above the city, nothing ostentatious, but built with intention. It had clean architecture, warm light, and most importantly, a dedicated office where I could work without balancing a laptop on the edge of the kitchen table. Isabella and I had grown not just professionally, but together. She had been promoted to regional director in her firm, and our lives had started to feel less like survival and more like design. Eduardo visited occasionally. He never overstayed, never imposed. But the man who once mocked my ideas now listened carefully when I spoke. When I showed him the early beta for a new machine learning feature aimed at low-income housing analytics, he asked if he could help fund the rollout, not as a partner, not as a stakeholder, but as someone who believed in the mission. At our daughter's christening, I saw him standing near the buffet table with a group of his business friends smiling in that restrained way of his. When I walked over, I heard him say, "That's my son-in-law, Matías. He didn't just build software, he built a system that's going to outlast all of us." It was the first time I'd ever heard pride in his voice that didn't come from comparison, but from truth. As I stood by the window later that night, watching the lights of the city below us flicker like pixels in a dream, I realized something I didn't need to win Eduardo's approval. I just needed him to stop blocking his own vision long enough to see clearly. And now he did. Legacy, after all, isn't what you pass down. It's what you finally learn to let go of. This wasn't a story about revenge. Not really. It was about something deeper, something every man who's ever been doubted, dismissed, or quietly disrespected understands in his bones the need to be seen as you are not as others label you. Matías didn't fight back with rage. He didn't try to convince his father-in-law with arguments or outbursts. He chose the harder path, the quieter one. He built something real. He let his actions speak in places where words had always been ignored. And in doing so, he taught us a powerful truth. Sometimes silence is not weakness, it's strategy. We live in a world that rewards noise. But some of the most meaningful victories happen in silence behind the screen, in the midnight hours, in the moments no one applauds. When respect finally arrives, it doesn't need to be demanded. It comes because of the man you've become, not the approval you've chased. If you've ever felt overlooked, know this time, patience and work done with conviction speak louder than anything shouted across a dinner table. And if this story resonated with you because you've lived through something similar, or because you're still building quietly, let me know in the comments. Even just a few words like, "That silence was mine too." It's in sharing that we remind each other we're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, stories of dignity, growth, and earned respect, subscribe and stay close. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truth.